On the state of our economy and GDP growth rate, we are joined via Skype by Xhanti Payi, an economist and head of research at Nascence Advisory and Research. Good evening, Xhanti. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, manufacturing and mining were the main contributors to the GDP figures, and they have been our major concern. What contributed to their performance?
Good evening. I think mining was particularly a surprising one. But I suppose, coming from a very low base in the first place where we know in the first quarter it declined by 18%, and, over time we're watching that mining production, improve, even though it was still very much in the lower negative. I guess in that sense, from a lower base, it helps. But certainly, I suppose also there has been some improvement in terms of some of our trading partners, and I suppose also the weaker rand has contributed to some of the gains in the mining sector. And also we've seen some relative stability in terms of the labor sector in that environment. So a combination of those issues probably helped us out. But we also know that the mining sector does contribute, for example, to construction. It does contribute also to some of the manufacturing when we think about some of the manufactured goods that come through there. And then, of course, manufacturing probably telling a similar story around the competitiveness of the currency and some of the stabilization in the manufacturing sector. And so over time, we've seen also over the past few months, it's something that we've been expecting around the manufacturing sector, that there would be improvements. We also saw around jobs that had dipped in the first quarter and then recovered quite nicely in the second quarter in terms of just manufacturing employment. So there has been some improvements that are promising, but there's no doubt that mining did surprise on the upside.
Now, Xhanti, let's look at this figure, about 0.5% better than expected. Is this growth significant to expand the economy and create those much-needed jobs in the long run?
Well, I think it does suggest that, there's potential for this economy. I think a lot of things that we always say, we always repeat it, that the South African economy is quite resilient. It's quite sensitive, and we are able actually to achieve quite a bit by just touching a few things. And as I say, there's been a lot of things that we've been talking about around what are the touch points that we need to fix to actually make sure that the economy starts to improve and actually does create the kind of response that we want. And certainly, you want it to be competitive. We want a space in which, I think, one of the things that you will notice in this number, because remember GDP is measured in two ways. One is expenditure, and then one is production. On the production side, we've seen this really nice number that we've seen in terms of manufacturing, but we're also looking at expenditure. We've seen that exports have done really, really well, and I suspect that one of the things that's been happening is that global demand coming through in terms of the more competitive rand. And you hear manufacturers saying they were starting to actually look outwards to see what they can do, given that we are becoming a little bit more competitive than we were before, and we're becoming more productive. So there has been some signs that we could actually, gain some momentum and do better. But it depends on the right kinds of things that we continue to do in the quarters and years to come.
Now, Xhanti, you've mentioned what these figures signal. Now, Treasury, the Reserve Bank and other institutions were said to be expecting little or no growth overall this year. Does this change the predictions for the year in any way?
Well, I guess we are seeing only the second quarter. But, the Reserve Bank was particularly alarmed, I think, by what happened in the third quarter. If you remember, what happened in terms of Brexit and the situation in Europe, where they are worried around, because Europe is such a big trade partner, that I think that was one big thing that sparked concern for the Reserve Bank in particular. And so we haven't seen the data coming through for that. But in terms of manufacturing, there's still a lot of good momentum in manufacturing. So, and I suppose the rand has stayed competitive, costs have stabilized. So there is still very much a good story to tell there. Hopefully it is something that we can sustain throughout. But we are not out of the woods yet, because we still have that, the third and the fourth quarter to look at to see whether or not we will continue this momentum. It is something to hope for at the moment, especially if you look across the different sectors that have shown improvement. It's fair, of course, that agriculture hasn't done so well, and that the predictions are that things are still very, very tough in that sector.
Now, speaking of a good story to tell, this debate on growth takes us back to an earlier argument you raised at the beginning of the year about the need for an economic codessa of some sort to deal with race and inequality. Are these two social ills to blame for slow growth to date?
Look, there are a number of factors, and I think, the government has said they would focus on them. We need a report in terms of what the issues have been. We know the labor problems that we've seen, for example, are exactly as you say, that the social ills of inequality, that many of the problems we've seen in the labor sector, the volatility there, and the instability has come from, people saying, we are feeling excluded, we are participating in this economy, but we're not getting the benefit. And, the Deputy President was sent to say, go out and look into the labor environment, in terms of issues of how strikes happen, strike balloting, the voice of workers, minimum wages. And all these things are very important around that question of inequality and the instability that it has caused in the economy. And so we are hoping to hear something from that, and that will actually lead us somewhere in terms of deciding on whether or not we're actually making progress in terms of dealing with inequality in particular, and around the instability that it causes in the economy, because it will continue in this way until we actually find a sustainable solution in which all parties agree. I think one of the things that we saw at the beginning of the year with Minister Godan going around the world trying to convince investors that, we are still safe, is that he took, the labor unions, he took business, and of course government was there to go and tell the story that we are united and we are trying to work together, and hopefully we can show some results in that respect.
Now, Xhanti, let's look at the manufacturing sector, a sector that's always been one to look at, one that's always been in decline for quite some time now, and one that we saw Treasury putting in a lot of money to revive it. Is this a sign that it's finally on the up again?
It is a sign that it's always on the up. One of the interesting things about the manufacturing sector, right, is that it has many parts, and it's also connected to many parts of the economy. So if you think about the mining sector, it has a role in terms of manufacturing and vice versa. If we think about some of the work that they've been doing in terms of the Industrial Development Corporation, we know that also the DTI, the Department of Trade and Industry, and some of the incentives. I know everybody always talks about motor manufacturing and the successes there. And the focus on by government in the manufacturing sector has been very important. And it's one place. And of course, manufacturers are always looking for new ways of doing things. We know that, the weaker rand is helpful in the sense that it forces locals to switch and look for cheaper alternatives locally. But also because we become competitive externally, we have that opportunity to actually invest in the manufacturing sector and take advantage of that. So there's also opportunity in the sector. What we need to do is to do the right things. And I think government has had a strong focus in terms of IPEP and the various iterations of IPEP to say we want to focus on the sector. We want to make sure it works. And hopefully, with all the interventions and the conditions that exist both domestically and globally, we'll be able to make it right. And I think it's good because I think we're also seeing some of the jobs coming through, because it is one of those sectors that can actually create jobs very quickly if we focus on the right thing. So hopefully it is something that we can sustain over time and going forward.
Now, Xhanti, rural development is the one area that remains adversely affected. What happens then if the economy remains in its current state?
But I didn't catch that. I think you broke it a little bit.
I was saying, let's look at rural development in this context of little to no economic growth. What happens if the economy remains in the state that it's in for rural development?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we have to do in rural development and in agriculture specifically is the idea that we have to invest in infrastructure. There's absolutely no reason why we as a modern economy in this kind of world where, we've got new ways of technology in terms of crops, for example, that can sustain droughts. We've got, we know weather patterns, they can be predicted pretty accurately. What we haven't done is to invest in the kind of infrastructure that allows us to store water, to irrigate properly, to help farmers with proper kinds of crops and storage. Those kinds of things that a modern economy should be able to do. And we need to invest properly. Our investment compared to our peers is very, very low. Our investment in people is very low. And so the things that we need to do actually is to spend the kind of money that is there to be able to uplift people, to bring in the kind of infrastructure, to bring in the kind of technology to be able to compete. And I think, where we've been left behind, even in manufacturing, is the idea that we have not actually worked and moved fast enough in investing in technology and infrastructure to allow people to move into the modern world and to be able to compete with their peers. And I think that is probably one of the biggest things we need to do in the coming years, to make sure that rural development is on par, and it would actually take not so long to actually turn the situation around.
The elections have come and gone, but we are currently seeing issues around the finance minister and the SOEs, of course. How is or will these hurt our economy?
Again, you broke there a little bit. Please repeat that for me.
I was saying, let's look at the current state of affairs. The elections have come and gone, but we still see issues around the finance minister, for example, and also struggles within the SOEs. How will this hurt our economy?
I think the biggest thing that it does is to erode confidence. Remember, one of the biggest things that we need in the economy to be able to continue to grow is the confidence that things are well, that we have stability, that we can trust, because most of us obviously, have saving. Many of us have savings. Some of us have jobs. Some of us don't have anything and want to take a chance. And anytime you're going to invest, anytime you're going to take risk, you want to be able to, to have some suitable stability or some suitable expectation that nothing dramatic is going to affect you negatively. And one of the biggest problems that we have with what we are seeing in the political environment, especially, is the idea that people can become a bit apprehensive. Business people are a bit wary of investing, of spending that extra cash to build that extra plant, to invest. Consumers, for example, are a bit wary maybe to build a house or to buy that new property or buy a car, because they're thinking, what if the world changes? What if there's a big collapse? What if I don't have my job anymore? And that is one of the things that we need to fix, because these sort of developments do wear away in terms of people's confidence, people's trust and expectations. And when that happens, then people hold back. And when people hold back, it means that we are not actually becoming productive, we're not taking risks, we're not investing. And that is one of the things that can actually reverse any gain or hold an economy from actually growing, as people sort of step away and have this wait-and-see attitude, which, of course, is not productive.
Now, just finally, Xhanti, economic growth is very important to ratings agencies. Could we expect a better outlook in the next rating outcome, or is it too early to tell?
It's too early to tell, because I think they're looking for trends. So one uptick is not good enough. Remember, one of the things we want to see is there a growth trajectory? Are we seeing something that we can sustain? And so if we see growth now, that's a positive thing. There's no doubt about that. And at the same time, though, they want to see that this growth is sustainable. Have we done the right kinds of reforms, the right kinds of interventions? And do we have the institutions and the people and the policies that can sustain this sort of path? And that, in the next quarter and the next quarter, this is what's going to happen, and that, we'll grow, we'll be able to, accumulate the taxes, to spend on the things we need to spend on, and that we are actually on the right path. And one quarter, I suppose, is not enough to actually show a trend. But I suppose by the time they get here in December, so maybe we'll have 2 quarters of positive growth and also a very strong suggestion and evidence that we are on the right path. Because if we don't have that, then it won't be helpful at all. Because actually what everybody is looking for, not just the ratings agencies, but even investors are looking to see, are we on the path, and not just one step, but actually a sustained path of growth and sustainable development.
We'll have to leave it there, Xhanti. Thank you very much for joining us on SABC News. That was Xhanti Payi, an economist and the head of research at Nascence Advisory and Research, helping us unpack the latest GDP figures.